Today, we are going through the basics of Pastoral Payroll. My name is Alex. I'm the head of the customer success team at Aplos. Been here for quite a while, and I have the privilege of doing these webinars a couple times a week, and every once in a while we do something like this, which is less software specific and more kind of topical. So today we're going to be going through this basics of Pastoral Payroll. A couple of housekeeping things at the top here. This webinar is being recorded. So if you, for some reason, need to leave early or have a connection issue or just would like to watch it again, this is available upon request. I do think that if you registered, you'll automatically get the recording link once everything is rendered, but I don't know that for sure. So if you don't get it and you want it, let us know. The slide deck is also available upon request, and I've also actually downloaded that and put it into the handouts for this webinar. So if you find the handouts tab, that should be waiting for you there. We will also have a large portion of today open for Q&A. I say the last 15 minutes, but really it's just whenever we're done talking about whatever the subject is, the remainder of the time is open for Q&A. So find that question field, type in your questions, and we'll do our best to get to everything here at the end. And if you have any additional questions on what we cover here today or anything off topic, whatever you need, just contact us using the methods below there, support@aplos.com, phone number, and we are open Monday through Friday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So what we're going to cover here today is kind of at a high level, we will be talking through topics that will discuss who is considered a pastor and who would be eligible for unique payroll exceptions or exemptions set up. And we're also going to walk through some nuances of pastors as employees, both from the employee and the employer perspectives. I didn't update this, but we'll probably touch on Gusto a little bit. We're not actually going to walk through Gusto specifically, but we will then kind of walk through a bunch of other kind of FAQs and different, try to skip a rock through a lot of the content here on pastor and payroll issues, and then having the open Q&A here at the bottom of the session. And as a special guest here today, I know very little on this subject. I mean, I know enough to be dangerous, but it's not an area of practice for me. I've never been someone to necessarily advise or have to do this in practice, but we have somebody joining us here today who is our CFO for Aplos, and his name is Jeff. Jeff, you want to introduce yourself here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alex. As Alex mentioned, my name is Jeff Bergman. I'm the CFO at Aplos, and I've been with Aplos coming up on 5 years now. I got my start in public accounting back in 2001. I was a business administration major with an emphasis in accounting. Got my CPA license in 2003. At that point, I got a master's of science in taxation. And I think it was around 2008. I continued on in public accounting for about 13 years before moving over to the private sector, where I've been working as a CFO at a previous company prior to Aplos, and then the last roughly 5 years with Aplos. From the standpoint of pastoral payroll, I really got interested in this area specifically because my brother-in-law is a pastor. He was a youth pastor at the time when I was getting my CPA license, one of my best friends, and he came to me and said, "Hey, I just got licensed. What do I do?" At which point that's when I kind of dove into the rules around pastoral taxation and what his options were and how he should be reflected by both the church that he was working for and then individually on his own tax returns, helping him through that. Like any good CPA, I will disclaim my knowledge in this area, having been out of practice for about 8 years now. So some of the information that I have may be a bit dated, as there have been some tax changes in the last 8 years.
Yeah. Yeah. When you said 5 years, it took me back a second. There's part of me that can't believe it's been 5 years already. It just seems like time's moved pretty quickly. But yeah, so thanks for joining us, Jeff. I have my areas of expertise, but this is one of those areas that if anybody's ever asked me this question and I've responded to it, the answer that I've given back has been because I've gone and met Jeff and then given the answer back. So he makes me look really good on this topic when it's not over webinar form. So this is kind of straight to the source here today from the Apple side. So as Jeff mentioned, a couple of disclaimers here. First and foremost is we, as a company, Aplos, we build and provide software. So we are not tax professionals in any sense. We do our best to answer questions, but for the most part, like 3 and 4 kind of denote there, we do our best to present information, do the best we can to help. But if something exceeds our expertise, or you need someone to get a little bit more kind of intimate with your situation and provide some more specific advice or help you through something, we always recommend consulting a CPA or a tax professional, someone that's kind of practicing in the field, that is up to date on the current regulations and standards and everything, so that you get the best and most accurate advice. And or if you have questions on how to set this up, usually your payroll provider will be educated, I would assume, in this type of topic to help through some of that as well. So we do our best, but standards change and can heavily differ between states. So for the most part, what we'll be doing today is kind of just going back and forth in more of a conversational style. I'm going to pick Jeff's brain on a few questions that I've kind of pre-populated here, and we'll go through them. It may not be in a particular kind of linear order, but we will just kind of have a conversation around this whole topic. So that foundation laid, let's talk through the basics of pastors and payroll. So I think what I'm going to do is maybe just put all the questions up here. I think that's probably the best way to do it. So these are the questions that I'm coming to the table with. These are the ones that I was thinking, these are what I want to ask Jeff. This is here, what I want to go through. And then after we cover these, then whatever questions you guys have as we go through this, put your questions in the question field in the control panel, and we'll do our best to answer everything afterwards. But let's just start at the top. So overall, Jeff, what is special about pastors when it comes to payroll? Why is this even a topic in the first place?
Well, when we talk about pastors and payroll, I think the first thing to distinguish between is from whose perspective are we approaching this? So I'm looking at this right now from the perspective of the church. The pastor, in addition to the complexities that the church will have in dealing with pastor's payroll, the pastor has some of their own unique complexities on their individual tax return, which if we've got some questions, we can cover that later on. But just as a frame of reference, I'd want to talk about it first from the standpoint of the church. So churches will have employees. Sometimes they have multiple employees. Sometimes, some small churches, it's just the pastor. When you have multiple employees, you end up with payroll tax filings and compliance around having employees. One of the big elements there is withholding Social Security and Medicare and other state or local payroll taxes at the church level. The pastor is different in that they are considered to have a dual tax status. So once a pastor meets the definition of being a pastor, then they are treated as an employee for some respects and as a self-employed individual for other respects. Where most people, how it's most easy to understand that difference is with respect to the payroll taxes. So a pastor is considered an employee for all of the employment benefits. So if there's a 401 or 403B plan or health benefits or whatnot, the pastor qualifies for those benefits as employees. But when it comes to payroll taxes, the church does not withhold Social Security and Medicare taxes from the pastor's paycheck. The pastor is responsible for those as self-employment taxes when they file their individual income tax return at the end of the year. I'll pause there, and then maybe you, Alex, if you have any questions specific to that you want to dive into.
Yeah, I think that kind of hits on one down below, and so overall, this is something that the pastors are choosing, right? So they are saying, me in this position, I would like to, opt out of paying those tax. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not an elective provision. So it is a definitional provision. If you are defined as a pastor, you are considered self-employed for these employment tax purposes. The church doesn't get to choose to treat you as an employee for payroll tax purposes. You are, by definition, under the tax code, self-employed for payroll tax purposes. So you can't elect out of it. So that begets the question of who is a pastor. So typically, the pastor is defined as someone who's licensed, ordained, or commissioned by their governing body, and they're performing services in the exercise of their ministry. So if you are a licensed pastor, but you are serving as a janitor at the church, you're not performing services in the exercise of your ministry there, you're performing janitorial services. So you're not deemed a pastor in that capacity. So there's the dual element there, licensed, ordained, or commissioned, and performing services in the exercise of your ministry. There's some case law around that. I think that gets to be a pretty deep topic if there's some fringe cases as to what exactly is performing services. Most people will just intuitively know, I am a pastor, I'm performing services in the exercise of my ministry. I'm doing weddings, funerals, Sunday services, and the like. So if they meet the definition, then they are considered a pastor for payroll tax purposes, and that means that they are required to be treated as if they were self-employed. They still do get a W-2 from the church, but instead of a W-2, which has federal withholding, Social Security, Medicare, maybe some state income tax withholding or other local payroll taxes on that W-2, the W-2 typically only has an amount in box 1 for gross wages, and then an amount in box 14 for housing allowance. Those are the only 2 items that are typically filled out for a pastor on a W-2.
Okay, so they're hired into the church with the kind of presupposition of the title, right? So let's say I'm a pastor. I want to get hired at a church. They hire me. The IRS, just based on how I file my taxes and that kind of thing, like I'm being hired into a position of pastor, right? So there's nothing special I need to do as an individual to, I guess, begin that, or is there anything that they would need to do kind of as the individual pastor to kind of trigger that treatment?
There is nothing that they need to do from an individual standpoint to trigger that treatment. So when I talked about my brother-in-law, his journey is he started and he wasn't licensed at the time, or he wasn't ordained at the time as a pastor. So he was a youth pastor. He wasn't ordained. He was going through that process, getting his master's in divinity, and he became ordained during the process. That was the point at which he was already performing the duties of a pastor, but he didn't yet meet that other qualification of licensed, ordained, or commissioned. At that point, the payroll for him changed. He became a pastor under the tax code at the point he was licensed, ordained, or commissioned. And then the church stopped withholding Social Security and Medicare and state and local taxes from his compensation. They then allowed him to designate a housing allowance. That was a choice that he made, which is a choice that pastors can make to recharacterize a portion of their compensation to be tax preferred for federal and state income tax purposes. So it's not an election that the pastor has to make. There are some elections that the pastor has to consider. This is beyond the scope of this webinar, but pastors can claim exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes. That's a really loaded topic. In order to claim exemption, you are saying that you're conscientiously opposed to receiving public insurance benefits for the services you're providing as a pastor. It's an irrevocable election. It has economic consequences, although the economics of it, according to the instructions, can't be considered as a factor in making it. And that election has to be filed. I might get the timing a little bit wrong here, but I believe it's within 2 years of first being compensated by the due date of the tax return after 2 years of receiving compensation as a pastor, as that licensed, ordained, or commissioned pastor performing services in the exercise of your ministry. So if a pastor's been doing it for 20 years, that is not an election that's available at that point. It's only when they're beginning their ministry that a pastor can do that. And that, again, that doesn't have anything to do with the church itself. That is, a pastor is making that election in their individual capacity, and it has implications for their individual tax returns, but not for the church.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it sounds like as far as the church is concerned, they just have to make sure that anybody that meets that criteria of an employed pastor. So however loose or specific that is, if you're a youth pastor or if you're an executive pastor, if it meets that criteria, then they would just need to do that election to not, pitching in for those things for that particular employee.
Yeah, and it's not an election. It is the person that's responsible for the payroll at the church needs to know, okay, this individual that we hired on is licensed, commissioned, or ordained, and they're going to be performing services as a pastor for the church. I need to know that when I set them up in the payroll software, I need to make sure that we're not withholding federal or state income taxes or Social Security or Medicare or other local payroll taxes. Now, I'll put an asterisk next to that statement in that pastors can elect into a voluntary withholding scheme where they can say, I want to have 25% of my paycheck withheld for federal income taxes, at which point the church withholds 25% of their wages or whatever the percentage is that the pastor elects of their income for federal income taxes. This is somewhat technical. When you look at the W-2, you'll have an amount that shows up in box 1 for wages, and then in box 3, there's federal income tax withholding. Those are the two amounts that then show up. That federal income tax withholding is treated as if it were an estimated payment on the pastor's individual tax return, or it's akin to an estimated payment. There are differences between withholding and estimated payments, is primarily related to underpayment of estimated tax penalties, but that's how that gets treated on the pastor's tax return. So there still is no withholding for Social Security or Medicare or other local taxes that would ordinarily be due by an employee or from an employee, but they can elect to have that federal and state income tax withholding to be withdrawn from their paychecks.
Gotcha. And then, so yeah, going back to maybe a couple minutes ago, you had mentioned when they get the W-2, everything is kind of reported into the gross wages, and then there's this separate denoting of the housing allowance. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about housing allowance? What is that? Is that just something that between the pastor and the church they negotiate, and that's just kind of an agreement to, part of the compensation package, or is there kind of something more unique about housing allowance?
So the housing allowance is not so much negotiated as it is an election of the pastor. So there are a couple of rules for a housing allowance. First of all, what's the point of a housing allowance? The point of a housing allowance is to exclude that income from taxation. So an amount that you designate as a housing allowance may, and I'll emphasize the word may, be excluded from your taxable income when when the pastor is filing their individual income tax return. The reason I say it's may is because there are actually 3 qualifications for housing allowance. It's the amount that's designated in writing in advance. So that's the first criteria. If the pastor is paid $50,000 a year and they designate the full $50,000 as their housing allowance, that's going to be the maximum amount that they can exclude from their taxable income when they're filing their individual income tax return. It doesn't mean that that will be the amount. If the pastor designates $1,000 as their housing allowance, that means that is the maximum amount that they will be able to exclude, or that they may be able to exclude when they file their individual income tax returns. So typically this is done through, it could be an elder or board meeting. Whatever the governing body of the organization is will oftentimes approve. The pastor will fill out and declare, my housing allowance is $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year, whatever it is, and that'll be entered into the minutes of the meeting of that governing body or that board meeting, or otherwise denoted in writing before the start of the year. So when I'm getting to 2022, I'm going to do that in December of 2021 to make sure that that's denoted in writing in advance of the year. The second criteria has to be an amount actually paid for housing allowance. So in my first example where I said it's $50,000, my salary is $50,000 and I'm designating the entire $50,000 as housing, but then I only spend $10,000 on housing. Well, just because I designated the whole $50,000 doesn't mean I can exclude that entire $50,000. I can only designate the lesser of the amount that I've designated in writing in advance, or the amount that I actually spent on housing, which would be $10,000 in that case. So even though the W-2 from the church's standpoint, the church is going to put the entire amount designated. So if the pastor in that case would have 0 in box 1 and 50,000 in box 14, it would look a little bit funny. And then it would be on the pastor when they're filing their individual tax returns to say, well, I know that box 1 is 0, but I need to add back $40,000 because I designated 40,000 too much. But that again goes to the pastor on their responsibilities in filing their individual income tax return. The church is responsible to put the amount that's designated in writing in advance in that housing allowance box. That's the amount that's reducing their box 1 W-2 wages there. The third criteria there is the fair rental value of a fully furnished house. So you might designate 30,000, you might spend 30,000, but you could go rent that house fully furnished for 20,000, and then that is going to be the limit. You can only exclude the 20,000 from your taxable income when you're filing your individual income tax return. So that's at a high level, that's the way that it works. Again, from the church's perspective, the church needs to make sure that they're getting that documented in writing in advance of paying it out. And then they're reflecting on the W-2, they're reducing the salary by the amount that was designated by the pastor as housing allowance. It's not up to the church to determine how much that housing allowance is. That's an individual decision made by the pastor and reported on their individual income tax returns.
Now, question for you. So I have the ability personally to perform weddings. I'm ordained through a website for friends. I routinely teach our customers. Can I opt in to have? I'm just kidding. We don't meet the tax avoidance there, but no, just kidding. Good. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it sounds like, and this is also, for my own clarity too. It sounds like from the employer's perspective, it's not too terribly different. There's not a lot of hoops to jump through, I guess, as far as accommodating for employing pastors. It sounds like most of it kind of ends up falling onto the pastors themselves to kind of treat things correctly when it's time to file their personal taxes. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, practically speaking, that's correct. Functionally speaking, that's where it gets challenging because not a lot of payroll providers understand pastoral taxation. So they don't understand how the W-2 is supposed to look. And they will by default, I've seen it many times where payroll providers will withhold Social Security and Medicare taxes from a pastor's wages when they shouldn't have. So that's where communication with your payroll provider is really imperative, making sure that the system, like, if it's like, for example, Gusto, if knowing where to go into Gusto to select exempt from federal taxes, exempt from state taxes, and making sure that that gets set up correctly within the payroll system itself. It's real easy to go on autopilot without going and checking those places where you're actually processing payroll to make sure that in the processing of the payroll that it's just mechanically getting done correctly.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of leads into this fifth bullet here. So for the employer, is there anything that they need to do to accommodate for this in particular? So it sounds like it's mainly kind of on the setup, like you said, it's kind of functionally different than the topic where setting things up right and making sure that they elect proper things. So is it mainly condensed to the setup and then, the ongoing management, or is there any other kind of compliance or any other forms, any other things that they as an employer would need to take care of to accommodate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from the compliance standpoint, the first is to see if they meet the definition. Are they performing services in the exercise of their ministry? I think that's going to be an easy one to answer. And then second, are they licensed, commissioned, or ordained? Do they have credentialing that qualifies them as a pastor? So it is incumbent on the church to answer those questions to determine, do they meet the definition of a pastor from a tax standpoint? So according to the IRS code, do they meet the definition of a pastor? And then once they meet that definition, then to follow up with the pastor on, do they want to elect a housing allowance? And if they do want to elect a housing allowance, to make sure that the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed, that the election is done in writing in advance of the year or in advance of payment if they were hired mid-year, to just make sure that they're getting the full benefit of some of those tax provisions that are available for pastors. It is a tremendous tax benefit to be able to exclude your housing allowance from your taxable income. And in many cases, it results in essentially a double deduction for pastors, as they will be able to exclude the amount they're paying for their housing. And then if they own their home and are paying mortgage interest and property taxes, which are typically deductible items. If they're itemizing deductions, then they get to write those off as well. So it can be a very positive tax benefit for pastors to be able to claim the housing allowance. And it's helpful for the church to help make sure that those compliance steps are completed so that they get that benefit.
Mm-hmm. And are there any benefits to the pastors, any pros and cons of them being set up like we've been talking about versus some sort of independent contractor? Or that my mind is going to, I'm not sure how standard this is, but I know in California, if you are of a trade and you work routinely for someone that that trade kind of applies to, it's like they want you to be an employee. So maybe that might differ by state, but is there any difference or benefits or whatever of kind of going through this employee treatment versus just getting a 1099?
So the question as to whether or not someone is an employee or an independent contractor is a legal question. There's defined case law on who is an employee, who's an independent contractor. It's not something that we get to choose. Oh, I want to be treated as a independent contractor. I either meet the definition of an employee or independent contractor, one or the other. Once I've met that definition, that is my treatment. From a standpoint of benefit, the biggest benefit for pastors to be treated as employees as opposed to independent contractors is that they qualify for the benefit plans. Independent contractors don't typically qualify for benefits at an organization. So if there is a 403B or a retirement plan, or there's a healthcare plan, or there's a group term life insurance policy, or one of the other many types of employment benefits that can exist, that would be the biggest differentiation between being an employee and being an independent contractor. From a self-employment aspect, there are a few nuances that will come into play on their individual income tax returns. As a pastor, which has a dual tax status of employee and independent contractor, that pastor can write off their unreimbursed expenses in the exercise of their ministry, the expenses that they are paying out of pocket. Maybe they have periodicals that they subscribe to, or maybe they have like research subscriptions or things of that nature, mileage that they're driving. They can reduce their self-employment income by the amounts that they're spending on those items, but they can't reduce their taxable income by the amount they're spending on those items. So I'm going to linger on that for just a moment. When you think about an individual's income tax return, who is considered self-employed, there are two different types of taxes that are being reported on one tax return. There's income taxes and there's self-employment taxes. They really are separate tax systems that are all going into one tax form. So the self-employment taxes is what I'm talking about specifically with a pastor being able to reduce their self-employment income by those expenses, but they can't reduce their taxable income by those items because they're treated as an employee, and unreimbursed employee expenses will not reduce your taxable income. A truly self-employed individual who is an independent contractor and is self-employed for all purposes, income tax and self-employment tax, can write those things off for both purposes. But in general, the value of the benefits that they receive as an employee far outweighs that benefit.
Excellent.
The other element there as an independent contractor is I don't believe they would be able to exclude a housing allowance as an independent contractor. I'm not positive on that one. That one I've never looked at it from that perspective, but that would be something that I'd need to look at.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it seems like one, if it's a specific box on a W-2 and a 1099 is a 1099, it might not have some overlap there, but yeah, would be worth looking into, I guess. Good. Well, I mean, we've hit a lot of my points here. The last kind of two here are, where would you recommend looking for guidance on this topic, or and then any last thoughts or advice, or just kind of last brain dump, anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think the answer for both of them is to find somebody that has made this area of practice a focus of theirs. So when I was doing it in public accounting, it started with my brother-in-law. He then referred all of his pastor friends to me. I ended up with quite a few clients that were pastors, which then meant I spent a lot of time in this area. Again, it was a long time ago. So find someone who has developed a niche practice that specializes in this area. The rules are nuanced and specific, and you want someone that's going to be staying up to date on them, that is versed with them, that isn't going to have to research every time that you ask a question. So my best advice would be to try to find somebody, and it may be by talking to other churches or other pastors to see who is it that they're using, to find a tax professional that is intimately familiar with the way that pastors are treated.
Good. And what is your cell phone number and personal email?
Right.
Now I don't know if there's any overlap here, but a couple weeks ago we did another webinar topic with the one on our staff. Her name is Ashley Berry, our services manager, and she was an auditor for a long time. And one of the gems that she shared was very similar. You know, when you're shopping out somebody to do your audit, it would be really beneficial to find an audit shop that is familiar with nonprofits or familiar with churches, just because of, I mean, I'm a licensed CPA, but that means that I sat there and I took some tests and now I'm doing it some in practice. But the areas of expertise and the trails that you can go down and the proficiency that you can gain is so varied. People see the title and figure they know the answer, but that is routinely not the case even with myself. So yeah, I think it's a good point. Finding somebody that you feel comfortable with and that is also an expert or at least very comfortable in the field in this particular subject matter would be really beneficial. So cool. Okay, well, that's about all I have as far as my kind of high level, questions and topics that I wanted to cover here today. So what I'd like to do now is just open it up for the Q&A time. We've got about 20 minutes left for us to answer some questions. There's a few of them here. So if you haven't done so already, find the question field in your GoToWebinar control panel and just type something in there, some sort of question there if you've got one. If you don't have any questions, feel free to let us know that as well. But I'll just start at the top and we'll go down the list here. So do pastors need to complete a W-4?
Typically, no. So the only reason you'd need to complete a W-4 is if you're wanting to elect additional income tax withholding. So the W-4, for those who aren't familiar with it, is the form that's used to tell an employer how much federal income tax to withhold. And this is one I may even have to look at it to see if there's a separate form for voluntary withholding. But it would be to designate the voluntary withholding amount, either as a fixed amount or as a percentage of the compensation. I haven't looked at it recently, and I know the W-4 form recently changed. So that's where, again, I've been out of practice for a little bit. But generally speaking, no, unless they're wanting to withhold federal income taxes, there is no purpose for a pastor to fill out a W-4 form.
Next is, are there settings in Aplos where we should set pastors as far as taxes are concerned? I mean, the answer to the Aplos side is no, we don't really have any employee setup or designations or anything on the Aplos side. However, in your payroll provider, there would likely be some setup there. And I know that for sure Gusto has that. I can't speak for any other payroll providers, but
yeah, the only other place where there might be a setup in Aplos is if when you're if you use Gusto and Gusto integrates with Aplos, if you're wanting the housing allowance to report to a different line item on your income statement as a separate expense account, then there would be a mapping place in the Gusto integration where you would go in and you could select that row to map to a specific account in Aplos that might be different than the wages. So that would be at the election of the person who's responsible for the financial reporting in the organization to determine. But it's not a setup that's required for pastors to receive their status as a pastor for payroll taxes.
more for the record keeping, just the categorization of everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's is the church only responsible for the amount designated by pastor for each year? And I believe this came around the time we were talking about the housing allowance. So is the church only, yeah, I guess maybe,
So
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think I might need to understand a little more about what the question is asking. So the compensation offer to a pastor might be for a salary of $50,000, and then that pastor elects to put 20,000 of that aside for their housing allowance. So the church is going to pay that pastor that full $50,000. It's going to be paid in two separate parts. One is wages and one is a housing reimbursement. They are responsible to pay that full amount for as long as that is the agreed compensation for the pastor. The pastor can subsequently change their housing allowance. So it's not a one and done. If a pastor moves and their housing costs go up or down, they can revise their housing allowance. That needs to be documented in writing in advance of the payments for it to get reflected in the housing allowance on their W-2.
Does it matter if the pastor is bivocational?
So if they are a pastor at a church and they have another job completely independent of that, is that what you're asking?
That is how I read it. We can wait and
Okay.
see if
Yeah,
we
it
have
does.
clarity there, but
So
yeah.
it does not matter for the purposes of how the church treats the pastor. So the church has hired a pastor. That pastor may have a second job. They may have income from book sales. They may have other sources of revenue that are coming in that they're going to be responsible for reporting on their individual income tax returns. That's between the pastor and the IRS. The responsibility or the obligations of the church to the pastor is, are they a pastor? Are they performing pastoral services for the church? And to treat them in accordance with the IRS rules based on that determination. So if the pastor has a housing allowance, they've elected the housing allowance, you would, as the church, you would separate out that housing allowance and report that separately on their W-2, even if the pastor has other sources of revenue, whether that be from another job, from royalties, from book sales, from wherever else that might be coming from.
Okay. This is going to hit a couple of questions at once, but as far as paying the Social Security and Medicare for the pastors, let me take a whack at it. So if it's all set up correctly, the Social Security and Medicare will be given to the pastor instead of the church submitting it on their behalf, like usual. So then it is up to the pastor to submit that, like self-employment requires, unless they've done that, irrevocable opting out to say that they are, not going to be paying into that and then not receiving the services in kind, right? So it is kind of on their plate to be responsible for those submissions.
I'm not. So I think this question could be answered in a couple of different ways depending on what's intended by the question. So sometimes it's a budgeting question. You might have two individuals that are working at a church that are paid the exact same amount. Let's say they're each paid $50,000 a year. One is a pastor and one is not a pastor. They're both performing pastoral services, but maybe one's not licensed, commissioned, or ordained, so they don't qualify as a pastor. Uh, that person effectively costs the organization more because the organization is paying Social Security and Medicare taxes, 50% of the Social Security and Medicare taxes on top of that $50,000, whereas the other person is going to be wholly responsible for all of the Social Security and Medicare taxes. Some organizations will adjust for this in the compensation offers, which I think is what you were saying, Alex, is that you're paying the Social Security and Medicare to them. So one might be 60,000 so that they have enough money to pay that the entire 15% of Social Security and Medicare taxes, where the other might only be 50,000, recognizing that the church is going to pay half of the Social Security and Medicare taxes. I'm not entirely sure that was the question. I also know there's some complexities within that area regarding reasonableness of compensation for the services that are being offered. So that can be more complex. From a budgeting standpoint, though, it is important for the church to know that offering a compensation package to two individuals may cost the church more depending on whether or not that individual qualifies as a pastor under the tax code.
Okay, and if the church wanted to, where is that one? Let's see. Oh, can the church help pay the 15.65% self-employment tax for the pastor?
So the church can agree to a reasonable compensation for a pastor. I have seen churches that will, let's say a pastor was coming from a non-pastoral occupation prior to becoming a pastor, and they're trying to do their budgeting, and they're used to this environment where their employer is paying half their Social Security and Medicare. I've seen churches that will increase the compensation offer to reflect that additional 15% being paid by the pastor. So they just, instead of that, in that example, instead of paying 50,000, it's they pay an extra 7.5% to cover that 7.5% that would otherwise be owed by that pastor to that church. I've seen that happen. I do think that that would be an area it's worth checking with someone who's more current in practice to confirm that the amount and the way in which you're paying it is structured appropriately. But it's not uncommon to adjust a compensation or to increase a compensation package to reflect the reality that the pastor has less dollars, after-tax dollars, from that standpoint, the Social Security and Medicare tax standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see, for a single pastor, parentheses employee, in a small church, from a church point of view, would it only be a simple check cut for housing and base pay, since most of the responsibility is on the pastor?
I'm not sure if the question is with respect to the payroll tax return filings, or if the question is registration within the state, or there's probably several elements that might come into play there. From a payroll standpoint, there are no Social Security or Medicare withholding obligations. If the pastor is the only employee, then you're not going to have to remit the pastor, you're not going to have to remit any payroll tax withholdings to the IRS. States, the state and local rules may vary a little bit. So that's where, depending on what state you're in, I might check with a local CPA to make sure that there are no local filing requirements. Generally speaking, it should be relatively simple, though, if the pastor is the only employee, because you don't have any of those withholding obligations that you then have to remit to a governmental organization for that purpose.
Okay. We have a process that allows pastors who are in process of licensing to be a lay pastor. Is it okay for them to receive housing allowance?
That one, I'm going to say that I don't know the answer. That's a great question. My understanding of it is that they have to be licensed, commissioned, or ordained, and performing services in the exercise of their ministry. If they don't meet the qualification of being licensed, ordained, or commissioned, then they are not a pastor. I think the two go hand in hand. Are you treating them as a pastor for payroll tax purposes, and do they qualify for the housing allowance? I haven't seen those split where they are subject to Social Security and Medicare tax withholding and yet can qualify for the housing allowance. There may have been changes again, so that's a great question. That would be one that we'd need to look further into. I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Yeah, a good reminder to, let's check with somebody that is up to speed and practicing in the field. So,
yep.
My understanding is that medical premiums should be paid as reimbursements rather than part of payroll. Is that correct?
So pastors are treated as employees for employment purposes. The medical premiums, now as employees, when you hire employees, you can have a number of ways in which a benefits plan is structured. You might have it to be where the church pays 100% of the employees' coverage and 0% of the dependents' coverage, or it could be some variation. It could be 50% of employees' coverage. It could be some portion of family coverage. There are a lot of different types of cost-sharing arrangements that are structured there. So assuming that the church has the benefit plan, so the church is the sponsor of this health benefit plan, that would be the church is going to pay for a portion of that benefit, which is going to be excluded from the pastor's compensation, provided they've got the premium only plan in place. And then the pastor may have withholding for their portion of it, which will be excluded from their compensation, which will be excluded from taxability, assuming they have a premium only plan in place. So that's kind of a technical question there, and it gets into how is the benefit plan actually structured. Sometimes you'll find people will have their own health insurance plan and they're getting a reimbursement for those benefits, which is different than what I was saying, where the church has a benefits plan. So the church sponsors a health plan and is providing that as a benefit to the pastor as an employee.
Good. We've got about, I don't know, 6 or 7 functional minutes left. So I'm seeing a couple of things that I think may just require some follow-up by somebody that is, again, up to speed and in the field. So I'm going to hit a couple of them that I think we can answer. And if we can't get to it, then always feel free to email us. We can just kind of clarify from there. But let's do it these 2 that I'm looking at here. So one of
Alex,
them is, go ahead.
Well, I just want to jump back to that last question one more time. So
Sure.
I think the question was, can you reimburse the pastor for, as I think about it, can you reimburse the pastor for their health insurance as opposed to reducing their compensation for their portion of it or providing as a benefit on top of it? So that I think is giving the example of the pastor pays for their own health insurance and the church then cuts them a check for the reimbursement of their health insurance. That gets to be an individual tax question with respect to the pastor individually. I'm not aware of how that could be excluded from their taxable compensation. It's not a benefit plan of a church. It's the church is cutting the check directly to the pastor. But that's where the pastor, before doing that, would want to check with their tax professional and say, hey, here's my compensation. I'm getting wages of this, my housing allowance of this, and I'm getting reimbursed for these premiums that I'm paying on the side. And they need to check with their individual tax preparer, whether or not that will be excludable from their taxable income when they're filing their tax returns. I'm not sure if it will. That would be one where they'd want to check. From the church's standpoint, it's possible that the church may be required to report that amount in box 1 of the wages if it's not a church-sponsored plan. But there's no, I'm not aware of any penalties that would be imposed on the church because there's no withholding that's required on any of that.
Okay. Let's do 2 more. So one of them is kind of a combo. How does housing allowance get reported if the parsonage is provided? And then someone asked right below it, what if the church owns a parsonage and the pastor does not pay rent? Does that get included in the housing allowance?
So my understanding is that it would be reported in box 14. The fair rental value of that property would get reported in box 14 of the W-2. So the individual you'd have to determine what is the fair rental value of that property, and that gets reported in box 14. And then they are responsible for their Social Security and Medicare taxes, their self-employment taxes on that. I didn't see that one in practice. So that's one where, again, I'd want to check with someone who has come across that. That wasn't one that was common. Most times, what I saw in practice was they would rent or own a house on their own, and they were designated a portion of their wages. But I believe it would still get reported in box 14, the rental value of that property.
Okay. Well, last question, and then anything that has not been answered yet today, again, you are free to email support@applos.com or give us a call. There's our contact information there. But as kind of the send-off question here, nice and cheery one, let's say that they have been doing it incorrectly. What would be the process of now doing it correctly? And would there be any steps to fix anything? Like, the question is, what if we've been withholding Social Security and FICA on the non-housing allowance portion of the pastor's salary? So if they've been, processing payroll, not factoring in the special treatment for pastors, what does that look like?
There are a couple of different ways. I think the first step is correct it going forward. So figure out who are the pastors that shouldn't be subject to Social Security and Medicare tax withholding. Reach out to the payroll provider and correct it moving forward. Then the next question is, do you correct it going backwards as well? That gets to be a little more complex because it's not only impacting the church's payroll tax returns, which is probably the more minor impact of all of it. It also is going to impact the pastor's individual income tax return filings. They would get corrected W-2s for the prior years, and then they would have to go and amend their individual income tax returns. So it really requires a close look at uh, what's the exposure or the risk? Are there any taxes that haven't been paid, whether it came out of the correct pocket or not? Is there any unpaid taxes that would be required there? And to look at it from that lens to determine, do I need to go back and amend these returns? That one, again, I would reach out to a local tax professional who could look at that analysis and say, you know what, it was one employee, it wasn't a lot of dollars. The taxes were paid. They were just paid by the church instead of by the pastor on their individual tax return. Not that big of a deal. Let's just correct it going forward. There might be situations where, no, we need to make sure that this is right, and the amount is different, and they want to go back and actually correct those W-2s for the prior years and the payroll tax returns for the prior years. What ends up happening is the church submits corrected payroll tax returns, and then they get a refund of those taxes because they uh, withheld some taxes from the pastor. Those taxes have to be paid back to the pastor, and then they get a refund for their portion of the Social Security and Medicare taxes that they withheld from the church as well. And then you have to decide, what do we do with this excess withholding that we got back that we were looking at in the form of compensation to the pastor, although it doesn't technically meet that definition. So I don't have an easy answer for that one. The place I would start is fix it going forward. And then if you have a tax professional that you know is familiar with this space, to talk to them and see what is the exposure, and do you need to go back and file those corrected payroll tax returns.
Excellent. Well, this is a big topic. We covered a lot. Jeff, thank you for taking the time out of your day to attend. He's very rare to get on a webinar, so you guys should feel privileged to have the hour. But again, kind of as an overall disclaimer, again, we build and provide software. We are more than happy to help clarify, instruct, and guide where we can. But this topic is a good example. It can be very nuanced. It differs kind of depending on your state and unique kind of situation, and there's a lot there. So where we can help, we're happy to. But if you have any other further questions, feel free to reach out to us. And then if we can't answer it, we'll just be very honest and say there's experts in the field, and we should probably refer you to one of them. So thanks again, Jeff, for your time. I appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody else appreciates it as well.
Yeah, happy to join.
All righty. Well, we'll do this again next week. Sounds good? No, Jeff? Right on. All right, everybody. Thanks for showing up, and again, thank you for being flexible with the timing shift. So, if you have any further questions, let us know. Until then, thanks for using Aplos, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.